welcome everybody to the first of a series of webinars that will be sponsored by the Union for Traditional Judaism on Jewish issues relating to the coronavirus. Well, I don't know about you, but I am ready to break out of my house. And aside from getting a haircut, the first thing I want to do is get to my shul and daven with a minyan. I have a yard site coming up, and right now I don't see any possibility of my being able to say Kaddish for my father for the first time since he passed away. And that is not, anything uncommon. But when we open up and when we go back to our Minyanim, I think our Minyanim are going to be a little bit different. And I haven't personally given any real thought on how it's going to be different, but I know that our speakers for today have given a great thought and are going to share their wisdom with us. Our first speaker is Rabbi David Novak, who is the Richard and Dorothy Schiff. He holds Richard and Schiff Chair at the University of Toronto and is a professor of Jewish Studies and Philosophy. He also is the president of the UTJ, and even more important, and he reminded me of this when we spoke earlier today, he is one of the founding members of the UTJ. UTJ was started on the 34th day of the Omer in 1983 when he met with Rabbi David Weiss-Halivni and Dr. Saul Shapiro and brought us into being. And for that, I personally thank him very much. Our second presenter today is also Rabbi Novak, Rabbi Marianne Novak, who has been serving the Jewish community for most of her adult life, while also dealing in other frivolous pursuits like going to law school. She is a graduate of Barnard College, Washington University School of Law, and most recently in 2019 from the Yeshivat Bat. She's worked with women's tefillah groups in both St. Louis and Skokie. She has been an instructor and curriculum developer for the Florence Melton Adult School of Jewish Learning for over 21 years. She is currently a fellow in the Created Equal Educators Fellowship of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And she's also a longtime member of the board of the UTJ. Before I turn this to the rabbis Novak, I'm a little surprised by both of you having the same last name. Do you guys know each other?
Yes, there's a family connection.
Glad to hear it. Okay, Rabbis Novak, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think that Rabbi Marianne should begin.
Okay. As Sandy mentioned, a lot of us cannot wait to break out of our homes. I live in Skokie, Illinois, and the Governor J.B. Pritzker, who my mother went to school with his parents, was dad, have started to move us into a phase 3, where there's going to be lightening of restrictions, and that includes also for houses of worship. And there's just been an announcement that houses of worship, they can meet if they meet less than 10 or 10 up to 10, but with social distancing and all those safety practices. In our community, the Aguda of Illinois is going to start Minyanim. And they're primarily going to be outside as much as the weather will tolerate. The CRC, however, which is the Chicago Rabbinical Council, which is a more, I guess it would be considered the centrist Orthodox body within in my community, is not going to be meeting. They are going to continue the stay-at-home order, and they, as per advice for rabbis and doctors within the community, they have decided that we are not going to be opening. However, my synagogue, Skokie Valley, like many other Orthodox synagogues, have been having people daven together via Zoom, but not it as a minyan. There is something understood that even if you're praying in isolation, that just the fact of kind of being with other people, because there is that experience of being with people, that would work out well. But the question has come up regarding Yizkor's coming up for Shavuot. We had this over Pesach, and saying Kaddish, which I also had to say right after Pesach for a yortzeit. The way that we handled it is that there are many rabbinic authorities said that it would be okay to say Kaddish at home if you could. And we arranged through our shul just to have people kind of being there in the virtual room with us, but understanding that this was not a minyan and would not constitute a minyan. The other question that comes up with reopening is that I know New York and in Chicago as well, it's 10 people. And then the question arises, which is something that's very important to me, should be important to all of you, is what do you do with women? How do you count them? If you know you need 10 for a minyan and it's 10 men, then what are women supposed to do who don't have the chiyuv to daven in a minyan, but want to be part of that minyan experience, either to say Kaddish, or this has become their practice and this is what they want to do. What has been a very interesting happening or result of this kind of understanding of public minyan is that, as Sandy mentioned, I helped start a women's tefillah group in St. Louis, and I've been a gaba'it for the one here in Skokie for over 25 years. And when women's tefillah groups were starting, which are not minyanim, we don't do no divrei b'kedusha, none of those things that require a minyan. But one of the biggest arguments that was given that women should not have these separate tefillah groups was that the only real tefillah was b'tzibur, with men and women together. So that argument actually flies out the window under these circumstances because everybody's davening at home. And you can't say, well, you have to only daven within a minyan because nobody can daven within a minyan. So these are all big questions that are trying to be resolved. And I think actually one of the reasons that certainly my synagogue and CRC synagogues here are not opening is not only because they have a preponderance of a population that is in the most vulnerable and for safety reasons, but also for many of those shuls, going to shul is not just men in a minyan. It's everybody. And they want to have, I think they're waiting for the numbers to go up so that people that would be allowed to go into the synagogue, so that they would allow men and women to come back together as far as davening goes. Now, I've looked at some of the guidelines of how tefillah might look when shuls go back. And to be quite honest with you, some of the new choreography that's going to be required is painful and also seems honestly a little absurd, of how to read the Torah, of how aliyot are going to look like, what those things are going to look like. And I think for some people, it will be fine. In other words, you have a camp that will say it's either 100% or nothing. And then the other camp will say, well, even if it's 50%, I really need to be going back to shul. So these are the questions that are coming up. And as far as how minyans are going to be in the future, I don't think that we can just throw off the table what a virtual minyan will look like. I think that's coming down the pike in one way or another, in the same way that we're going to have to make some sort of considerations for technology in every part of our life. It's going to be increasingly impossible not to engage with technology in our everyday activities. This includes questions about Shabbat. But down the road, we'll have to see where this goes and whether this is just a blip or what we call a shat chak, an extenuating circumstance, or whether there'll be actual repercussions. And I think they will be. In the general society, it already is pretty clear that the way that people go to work is going to be forever changed. That people are not going to be commuting 3 hours to work for a meeting that they really don't have to be there in person for. Air travel is going to change. All those other things are going to change as well. And to think that it won't filter down to some degree into the way that we worship, I just don't see that happening. I don't think it'll be immediate. I don't think we should go for such a radical change that all of our davening will go onto Zoom or a virtual platform. I think that would be very foolish. But to understand that there's certain segments of the population that were finally being served during this time, that's something we cannot ignore. So there has to be a careful balance of understanding of whatever we're going to learn from this experience, and not use it just for sweeping change, but just to recognize those places where the change was really meaningful and helpful, and not use it as something to completely turn everything over. I think that would be very foolish and won't serve nobody's needs. That's something that we just need to be very careful about. So those are halakhic consideration, social considerations, how to really, and now Orthodox shuls, for the most part, who might not have been thinking about women and tefillah, are now having to think about it very seriously. So these are all good things, and hopefully will lead to an inclusivity that is in a way that doesn't just recognizes what had been going on beforehand and makes it more accessible to people in a way that is in concert with halakha and tradition. But some things are going to change. There'll be, it cannot not change because many of these people have had an experience that it will be very hard to say, well, now we're not going to do that anymore. That's just very hard. That's very hard to kind of completely throw that out the window. So those are the considerations that I'm noticing, and how synagogues are going to try to make sense of this horrible event that should end b'mhei Rabbi Yameinu, sooner rather than later. And just as a short pastoral note, and then I will turn it over to my father, there's a lot of discussion among other parts of our community that are not following rules. And there's been kind of an obsession about that, I know, in New York. And we've had it here as well, too. And I've been asked that question, and I'm not here to comment on any other part of the community with whoever is following rules or not. But I think just in our own communities, we need to be very cognizant of people who have lost loved ones during this time and have not been able to be served properly by their communities. They didn't have a real funeral. The Shiva was virtual. And those are the people that we really, really, really need to remember when all this is over, as opposed to trying to change things for the future, making sure that we take care of those people who were truly underserved by all of this. So that's my kind of parting note of something to keep in mind when we evaluate when this finally comes to an end.
Okay, let me weigh in a little bit. The question of orders from governments that you can only have 10 people. We're going to have something like that in Ontario, the province where I live. I find it rather strange that how docile some of the religious leaders have been. Liquor stores are open. You can have more than 10 people in the liquor store. I think that with proper spacing, especially a number of us have, large synagogue, I think with proper spacing, it could be more than 10. And one of the things that's being but here again, I do agree that there have been people who have not been served, and there might be a way for people who are what we used to call shut-ins or whatever to be able to at least feel that they're participating in a minyan, even though a minyan clearly are people within the same real space. Now, I know that a number of congregations, I've talked to a number of rabbis, when it reopens, and especially on the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the notion of a staggered service. In other words, that you would have 4 different services for Shachrit. One group would come from 7 to 9, another group would from 9 to 11, the third group 11 to to one. And I think that's quite feasible. Halakhically, it's not difficult. The only problem would be that the people who came later, the question of the time that one says Kriyat Shema in the morning, but people could clearly could be informed that they should say Kriyat Shema at home. I know that in the minyan that I daven in, the rabbi during the summer will frequently tell people that the service starts at 9, but you should really say Kriyat Shema before we get to Kriyat Shema in the service, so that you're you'll say if you fulfilled the actual time. Shacharit can be said with daylight saving time, sure, and up until 1, till Tzarayim. Musaf, very interesting, can be said the entire afternoon. In fact, if you had it was getting dark and you had to say Mincha, you could actually say Mincha first and Musaf afterwards. I mean, Shat halakhic. But this would be ways of dealing with it. And I've suggested to certain rabbis that the way to do it would basically be as follows. Psuke de Zimra, we should follow the Sephardic custom, where Psuke de Zimra is basically people say that individually. So the service would start, let's say, at Nishmat. When it comes to the real length of a service on Rosh Hashanah is Chazarat HaShatz, the so-called repetition of the Amidah. And it's interesting that the Rambam had a famous takona for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He eliminated Tefillah B'Lachash. He eliminated the silent saying and then the repetition. He said, because people said, I've already said the Shemona Esrei, and they're talking and whatever. Well, this would be for a better reason. Really, everyone would say the Shemona Esrei, or the Amidah, in terms of Rosh Hashanah, we're both for Shacharit and for Musaf. A number of the piyutim would have to be limited, except Natana Tokef, which nobody would want to give up. And also, I think that could easily be done within 2 hours. Blowing the shofar is not a problem, because you can blow the shofar all day on Rosh Hashanah. And I think also, especially on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, when many people, this is the only Torah they're getting. Granted, the rabbi's sermon is not going to be the half hour or 45 minutes, but I think that that it's important that they hear some drasha, whether it's 10 minutes or whatever, that's not just strictly rote davening, that this is, this is the whole business of in Talmudic times of the Meturgaman, who didn't just translate the Torah reading, but expounded on it. So I think that these are, factors that have to be taken into consideration, but they should be they should clearly be regarded as stopgap measures. I mean, one of the tragedies of all this that's going on is people have already been isolated and socially separated. I'm always amused at a certain Italian espresso place where I go and have coffee across from my office at the university. I will see young people on a date, and they're both looking at their cell phones. So I mean, this is the people are separated enough, and I think that these stopgap measures are wonderful. I think that there are certain liberties that can be taken, but the fact is that in terms of Minyanim, if we just say simple, okay, you can do it over Zoom, you're turning people into spectators. And I remember a number of years ago hearing that there was a large conservative synagogue in some city and whatever. Instead of an overflow service with another rabbi and another cantor, they had a television screen. And they turned the people into spectators. Now, I know that when I wrote this tshuva about using Zoom for the Seder, and my wife and I were able to participate with Marianne and her family. I was very clear that the people have all the foods in front of them, and that they don't listen to somebody else's kiddush and say amen, but they say kiddush along in the Haggadah and whatever. And it was very important. It wasn't as good as being together, but it was certainly better than two people sitting there and whatever. Even though there's a Gemara in Arbe Pesachim which talks about the fact that even if you're by yourself, you have to ask yourself the 4 questions, and you can imagine what that must be like. These are factors. There are certain liberties that we can take, but I think that these should be regarded as stopgap measures. And what is going to happen, and here again, I'm just speculating, is yes, optimally, the best solution is a vaccine and whatever, but there might be sooner a way of treating it. You know, when AIDS became a tremendous problem, they still haven't found a cure for that, but they found that people who had AIDS, there were certain medications and whatever that they can lead a normal life and not infect other people and whatever. So I mean, these are a number of the factors that require ingenuity. But ingenuity is something, and I always think of, and she happens to be a good friend of mine, Lou Greenberg, where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halakhic way. Well, yes, to a certain extent, but there are certain things that we cannot do as much as we would like to do it. And I don't think that a minyan, I think that it's important that there be a real minyan there, and people who can't come will at least get some sense of participation. And even though technically maybe they shouldn't say Kaddish along with it, but if they do, it's nobody's going to be that upset by it. But it means that the ikar is the real people in real space, and the tafel is people participating through Zoom. Now, we've all taken advantage of it. I know that I have a wonderful group of people that have been meeting with me for 23 years, a Gemara share, and we're doing it online. And it's getting easier. People are being more participating. It's a wonderful thing. But I'm looking forward to when we can go back. And in fact, I'm even considering that if we go back and we need social spacing, that instead of meeting in the home that we've been meeting in, I'll get some large synagogue where people can be properly spaced, and then we can let some people participate, by Zoom if they physically can't be there or don't want to be there. University of Toronto, for example, where I teach this fall, we're going to dual method. That is, students can choose whether they want to be in class or do it over Zoom. Fortunately for myself, I teach upper level classes, so I don't teach any big lecture courses. Big lecture courses need to be online. But I have a feeling that unless there's a big spike in cases here, and every community is different, that the vast majority of students are going to want to be in class, even if maybe they're taking a little bit of a chance. I know 3 of my 4 grandchildren, including are teenagers or pre-teenagers, and they're really suffering. And I'm sure that they're most anxious to get back into real space with real people. So here again, I agree with the Marianne that on the one hand, we can't just simply, ignore this and have kind of the social mixing that is dangerous. And on the other hand, simply have all of the chumras that people can possibly think of on the other side. It's interesting that so-called right-wingers are more lenient and the middle and centrists or otherwise. But so, I mean, I think that is what needs to be done in the interim, and hopefully and prayerfully, when we do come back to a real live situation, we don't have people who can be with us in real space deciding that they would rather be in virtual space. I think the virtual space should be that you've got to make a very strong case of why you can't be in real space. So those are some of my thoughts on how we should approach this. But I especially feel for people who have to just have what's called a private shiva. I see it in the paper. They can't say even Kaddish when they're burying somebody. That is awful, and we should go out of our way to contact these people, even if we normally wouldn't. They're part of our. Usually, you only pay a shiva calling your close friends and whatever, to help them through this. It's a terrible time anyway, and this makes it that much worse.
We have a couple questions, Dad, that I'm going to just read for you. What about the question of people wearing masks? If the Baal Tefillah is wearing a mask and you can't really hear them, although that just might be trial and error with a mask. And during the week, I think if that was the case, during a weekday minyan, you could use a microphone if it was necessary for the Baal Tefillah to be heard during the week. There was other question about using somebody virtually to give testimony in a Beit Din. I think we don't want to be going in that direction. I think those changes, at least at the moment, we want to preserve and make sure that people are actually there to give testimony or expert testimony. One thing that came to mind, Dad, as you were talking, I don't know, for the people out there, I went to rabbinical school at Yeshivat Maharat. Most of my time was online in class, in a Zoom classroom. I spent 4 years online at Zoom, and then I was lucky enough to come every month and be in the Beit Midrash in person. And one thing I was thinking about is that when I was there in person, because I was interactive, I was not a spectator, I was interactive in those classes. I would tell my father many times, he would ask me how I was doing, and I would say, well, I was the Gemara reader for a week. So it was very participatory, so that when I did come into the actual space, I had the relationships with my teachers and with my classmates, and it seemed very natural. I'm wondering if one of the hybrid things that might come out of this is a situation where there's an actual minyan, there are actual people there, but let's say somebody needs to say Kaddish and they're traveling and they can't get to a minyan. I'm wondering after this, if there's an actual minyan there, if someone could, during the week, obviously, Shabbat would be a host of other problems, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, if the person could zoom into the minyan, the actual minyan that is actually meeting, and just join in with them be able to participate and have their sound on, so that if they can hear and also be answered amen, because it does happen in real time. And certainly the experience, we're all experiencing listening to each other and seeing each other, and your brain actually is experiencing that you're actually with people. It's not the greatest, but it's the experience is I'm not having a dream and I'm not talking to a faceless person. So I'm wondering if that's one of the possibilities of some hybrid idea down the road. One last thing, someone asked a question about the RA that had a tshuva out now, that it would be okay to move to Zoom for everything.
The RA is the Rabbinical Assembly, the Association of Conservative Rabbis. Yeah.
Right. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think that is really not the way to go. I think it would be, again, this idea of turning everything over is not the way to meet the needs of people in the way I see. I think they're seeing that perhaps they're having more people come and tune in virtually, but and for human experience and for their synagogues to go, which is really not of our concern, but they really need to have people there. So I think that's an example of taking whatever lessons we have now and kind of pushing it forward in a way of not seeing what the repercussions are. Repercussions will be that no one will have any incentive to come into their shuls at all, which is not a good idea for anybody. So.
No, I agree with you, and let's get back to somebody who has to say Kaddish, and they participate over Zoom, but there's a real minyan there of people saying Kaddish. And I would cite an example that I'm sure will appeal to Jewish feminists like yourself, and that is, if you look at the question that's sometimes asked, can a woman say Kaddish? You're going to find two types of answers in the Orthodox or traditional community. One type of answer is, since she's not obligated to say Kaddish, she shouldn't say Kaddish, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the women's Tefillah groups that you've been leading for years avoid Davar Shabbat Kedusha. In other words, the Kaddish and Baruch Hu and whatever. However, many years ago, the late Rabbi Goren, Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, chief rabbi of the IDF, and then chief rabbi of Israel, wrote a tshuva to a woman in Baltimore who was a student of mine. He wrote at the top, "Lo lepirsum," not for publication, which is it was like taking an ad out of, he basically had taken an ad out of the New York Times, where he said that a minyan is based on people who have the same chiyuv, the same obligation. And therefore, he held that women could actually have a full davening. Now, I understand why the members of your community haven't done that. And actually, there's something wise in that, because by adhering to halakha, you can actually be more creative. Everybody knows the davening is too long and whatever. So that's one example. But clearly, many rabbis would say, well, if a woman, sitting in the women's section, stands up and says Kaddish, there are lots of people who say things maybe they're not required to say it, and it's going to be like Michal Bat Shaul, who put on tefillin, and according to one version, nobody tried to stop her. Okay. Now I'll go back to the women making a bracha on a mitzvah aseh shazman gromel. For example, women making a bracha on a lulav. What are there are three approaches. One approach was the approach of those who followed the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. I remember the late Rabbi Ovadia Yosef said that if a woman takes a lulav, it should be snatched from her hand. It's not her mitzvah. Rabbeinu Tam said, and then it was followed by the Ramban on the Sephardim, that a woman is including herself in those who are, doing that. It is not a mitzvah that's incumbent on a woman, but a woman can take it upon herself. And therefore, most certainly the Ashkenazic world, most women regard it as an obligation. Many women now own their own lulav, not just their husbands, and this sort of thing. So I think the problem with that was that some people took that far, and then whether a woman can be a shliach tzibur for a minyan of men, that becomes a whole different state, because can she relieve others of their obligation? That's a whole halakhic question. But certainly the idea of saying something along with people, well, technically you're not required to do so. I don't think it's lo michubah. Just, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. And it enables you some side of connectiveness, and we're not going to snatch the lulav figuratively from your hand. So, I think that those are ways that give us some precedence. But kind of these sweeping statements that seem to solve the problem. Well, let's just solve the problem by just saying you can do it. Undermines the whole authority of the system. The system is, and I always use as an example when people say, well, can't the halacha change? And I said, change, and I use the example of Marianne's husband, Dr. Noam Statland, my dear son-in-law, was a distinguished neurosurgeon. I said, yes, when my son-in-law changes people and operates on them, he changes them with either a scalpel or a laser beam, not a meat cleaver. In other words, there's a skill to it. There are ways that can be done, and there are ways can not be done. And it's the authority of the Torah Min Hashamayim, which means that we can do so much. We can correct certain things, but at the end of the day, it's the Torah that corrects us. So, we're all trying very hard, but to simply destroy the authority of the of the system for which might be a passing situation is something that is cutting your nose to spite your face. So those are, some of the questions that are raised. It's interesting about the question of a bet din. That's really not a problem. The only kind of bet in that we're going to need is a bet in for Gittin, and they claim in Italy the divorce rate is rising because of people who. But the type of bet in where you would take testimony from witnesses, we don't do that anyway for the most part. So I think that's an interesting question, but. As I would say in Yiddish, we have enough problems now to deal with, and I don't think that that's something that is, a burning issue that somebody should think about it maybe.
There are a number of questions. I'm just going to read the Q&A, and there were a lot of questions about understanding that in most cases, the last people we're going to be going to shul are the 60 and up population. And I don't think there's any way around that at this point in time, just as far as safety goes. I think holding out for a vaccine, which of course will be the greatest thing, and I'm just speaking because I have someone who's in the medical field, there will have to be something else. Otherwise, that might be long in coming. I think something else that just spiritually that we need to pay attention to in this time is how used to we are now of knowing that thousands of people die every day of this. I don't know if you remember in the beginning, when this first started, I would watch the daily press briefings from the mayor of Chicago, although I live in the suburbs, and from the governor, and we would watch them, and the president would have them, we would watch them, and we would look at the numbers, but now we are just numb to the numbers. And that's something that I'm very, very concerned about. I'm concerned about that there's going to have to be a way that we're going to have to make peace with the fact that people are still going to be dying, but we're going to have to figure out some balance to our lives. It's very numbing. It's very numbing. But as far as turning everything over, I think we were making the same point. As far as turning everything over because of this circumstance would be foolish, and also lose sight of the very subtle things that we can do, or more surgical, as the metaphor my father used, more surgical and precise ways of helping people when we come out of this situation. But also to keep in mind that once this is over, it will never be at normal. I think that's a hard reality for a lot of people. It will never go back to the way it was. And so a lot of these things that we have to adopt, we have to think about for the long term. It hopefully will not be this terrible, but things will change forever in the same way that 9/11 changed everything for the Western world. This will change a lot for us as well. But hopefully those things of including more people, having avenues, being more cognizant of what participation looks like, there hopefully will be more good than bad. Some other people asked a question about our other co-religionists who are violating the rules. I have to tell you, in the city of Chicago, every religious group has been violating the rules. We are amongst other people. Other populations seem to be violating the rules at the same, probably the same amount, but don't seem to be picked up upon as much. Although that's not so much true in Chicago. The African American community and the Latino community, who have been hardest hit by this, a whopping number of the 80% of the deaths in the Chicagoland area have come from those communities. And in certain communities, they were having family parties that had almost 200 people. So as far as being angry at our co-religionists and doing a Chil Hashem, there's really nothing you can do or even say. Just take care of yourself and be part of communities where people are helping and following rules. There's no sense in calling these people out. It doesn't do anything, and they've lost more people than we have, a tremendous number. So that's something just to keep in mind. Is it a Chil Hashem? Yes. Is there something we can do about it? No. But just keep in mind that they're suffering the most. They're suffering for a lot of communities because they have no access to any information. Their healthcare is poor, and it's controlled by their leaders, which is very unfortunate. So I'm actually asking for a little bit of rahmanas for them because they are really suffering the most within our own communities.
Well, they're yes, you're right, and nobody should cast aspersions on any community. However, since this is a phenomenon that is not a uniquely Jewish phenomenon, although the mayor of New York seems to think it was, uh, in looking at it very carefully, you will find that the religious leaders that were the most remiss were those religious leaders, and I'm not going to, you can fill in the blanks, in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic communities that seem that those segments of the population that invest in their leaders virtual supernatural powers are going to be those that are going to be the least, likely to obey the rules. They're going to somehow or other think that their greater righteousness protects them from these sort of things. But what the future is going to be like, none of us really know. Things are going to change, but we can't really predict how they. Futurology is hardly an exact science, and whatever. And therefore, I think we have to be cautious in making long-term projections and long-term. We just have to, try to solve the problems as they arise and realize that our methods are, piecemeal. We live in an imperfect world, but one of the things that I think that is emerged here is that balancing health needs with other needs. People are going to have to go back to work, and people are going to have some kind of a social connection and religious connection, and we are a community. We are the covenant is with the people of Israel. We're not a bunch of individuals who have come together and have certain similar ideas. Is that this is very difficult to say, because let's say to say that the last 100 or 150 years we've been spoiled, when we've had the Holocaust, world wars, and the Depression and whatever. But when it comes to our relation to the natural world, we've lived in a very sterilized kind of antiseptic kind of world. I mean, you read from the 18th century, the 17th, and 16th century, life was much more dangerous. The natural world was much more dangerous, and somehow modernity has given us a notion that we have a total control over the natural world, which is very much not the case. So that is going to have to be factored in. Yes, all of these precautions and whatever. And when it comes to the older population over 65, which I've been for several years, I think of the synagogue where I go, I would venture to say that at least half of the members are 65 or over. To eliminate them simply, I think, would kill the congregation. And that there's a little pikuach nefesh there also. A number of things have to be balanced, but anybody who gives us, wholesale solutions or absolute predictions of what is going to happen, I think we just have to, do it on a virtual day-by-day basis. And many of the rulings that we've made, the Talmud makes a distinction. It's in the main text is Baba Batra 130b, There's halacha, there's maseh, and halacha l'maseh. Halacha means that I have a theoretical argument of why something should be halakhic. But that doesn't mean it goes into practice. It might not be practical to implement it. Then there is maseh, which means a ruling for a particular case, but you're not supposed to generalize therefrom. Halacha l'maseh means that you have both a theoretical argument and you want to put it into practice, and it can be the basis of, well, most legal reasoning is by analogy anyway. So I think that a lot of our rulings now are l'maseh. I think the case at hand, the situation at hand, and as distinct from halacha l'maseh, or simply halacha, simply a wonderful theoretical argument that is totally and completely impractical. And I think that is the way it was doing. I remember, and I don't want to mention names, a certain posek who's known for being very, very strict and very, very dismissive of others, has given some very interesting rulings based upon the situation, which has given me some renewed respect for him. He clearly has some understanding of what's needed on the spot.
I just want to end, because I have to jump off to give another shiur. We are just a little bit of Torah. This week's Parsha is Parsha B'Midbar, and I think it's just so apropos that we have the description of our people, going in the desert and not exactly knowing where they're going, but always with a hope that they're going to get to something good. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind, because it's true. Anyone who's giving you future predictions of every little thing, though we can have some idea, I wouldn't trust them. But if someone is giving you something that's completely nihilistic in every way, that's not the way that we as Jewish people think. So just keep that in mind, that it will remain to be seen. If anything, I've been, as bad as this situation is, it has, for a lot of people within the Jewish community, finally given them a chance to really focus on their Judaism, which they hadn't before. And hopefully that will remain. Hopefully that will not leave them when we're able to get out of our houses finally. And hopefully those are the good things, and that maybe they see something beyond themselves, which is really the point of our tradition, to move beyond the self and to get something to be more godlike and closer to God. So for that, I will end. I'm sorry I have to leave, but this has been great. And Daddy, any other parting words? And
No.
Well, I'd like to thank the Rabbis Novak. And before we close, I'd like to make a pitch for the UTJ. First, the financial pitch, of course. Doing these programs is great, and we're happy to do them. We have other ideas to talk of a UTJ podcast, but if you're so inclined, go to the UTJ website, utj.org, and make a contribution of any size, $18, $36, $36,000, whatever you can afford. We really appreciate it. And also like to make a pitch for the UTJ in participation. You're on this seminar webinar, and you're listening to us, and that's great. But if you'd like to become more active in the UTJ, get in touch with us. We're always happy to see new faces and to bring them in and let them help us. So thank you very much. Have a good night, all.
Okay.
Allow me please to just quickly add a thanks to, of course, both Rabbis Novak and to Sandy for organizing this, as well as to our sponsors for this evening, Mitch and Leslie Morrison, Rabbi Miriam and Pinchas Klein, Rabbi Pinchas and Miriam Klein. I reversed that a little bit. And to myself, I'm Noah Grodowski, and my wife, Dr. Melissa Clapper. Thanks for your support, and thanks to everyone for attending. If you're on Facebook, please like us on Facebook and join our Facebook discussion group to have more discussions like this, and to be advised of future events like this. Thank you to everyone. Wishing everyone much safety and health and happiness.
Amen.
Amen.